There's a castle in northwestern Spain whose lord supposedly died in a Castilian dungeon in 1486. Within months, a navigator with no documented past began circling the Spanish court, asking Queen Isabella of Castile for ships. Officially, these are two different men, but a stubborn group of Galician researchers thinks they're the same person, and the closer you look, the stranger the resemblance gets. This is just one of many historical mysteries that surrounds Christopher Columbus, but some historians think this one has real meat on the bone. Pedro Alvarez de Sotomayor, better known by his nickname Pedro Madruga, was one of the most feared figures in 15th century Galicia. He'd been born around 1430 in the rugged northwestern corner of Spain, a place where feudal lords still acted like petty kings, long after that arrangement had quietly faded elsewhere in Iberia. His seat of power was the great castle of Sotomayor, perched high above the river estuaries that drain into the Atlantic just south of Pontevedra. From there, he ruled a private domain with an iron grip, ran his own fleet up and down the Galician coast, and made enemies of nearly every powerful institution he encountered. He picked up the name Madruga because he liked to attack at dawn, before anyone in his target town or castle had finished their morning prayers. By every contemporary account, he was intelligent, multilingual, politically slippery, and ruthless. He spoke Galician and Portuguese natively, and he picked up Castilian Spanish out of political necessity. He also had a working knowledge of Latin from his years at the Portuguese court, where he'd been raised after his father's death. He married well, fathered legitimate and illegitimate children across two kingdoms, and switched political allegiances whenever it suited his survival. By 1485, though, his luck had run out, and he'd been excommunicated by the Archbishop of Santiago. To make matters worse, his fortresses had been demolished by his rivals, and his alliance with the Portuguese king had collapsed. He was eventually captured, handed over to the Catholic monarchs, and held in Alba de Tormes, and the official record says he passed away there in 1486 of illness. The peculiar part is that no body was ever produced, and his family tomb in Galicia, when it was opened by his own descendants in later centuries, was reportedly found to be empty. Now hold that thought and consider the man we know as Christopher Columbus. The standard narrative places his birth in Genoa around 1451, the son of a wool weaver named Domenico Colombo. He's supposed to have spent his early years on Mediterranean trading vessels before washing up in Portugal in 1476 after a sea battle. There he marries a Portuguese noblewoman, Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, and begins pushing his westward route around Lisbon. By 1485, he's been turned down by the Portuguese king and has crossed into Castile to start lobbying Queen Isabella. The timing is almost too convenient since Madruga is captured and supposedly dies in the same narrow window that Columbus mysteriously emerges as a serious presence at the Spanish court. And the man who shows up doesn't quite match the wool weaver's son the official story describes. Columbus writes in Castilian, sometimes in Portuguese, but no surviving document from his hand is in Italian, not even his letters to Italian bankers. His Castilian is shot through with Portuguese and Galician features, and he moves easily among Iberian aristocrats. He also seems to know naval architecture, command structure, and Atlantic currents in a way no merchant's apprentice from Italy reasonably should. He also deliberately refuses to talk about where he comes from, even when he's questioned on it. His son Hernando, who wrote the first biography of him, openly admits that his father deliberately obscured his origins. Hernando himself couldn't manage to find a single relative when he traveled to Genoa to look. For a man who'd later be celebrated as the Admiral of the Ocean, that's a strange silence, at least according to the proponents of this theory. The case for the swap took serious shape in 1992 when a Galician engineer published a thick, footnoted volume arguing that Columbus and Madruga were the same man. He wasn't the first to suggest a Galician origin, since earlier scholars had already flagged the language clues, but he was the first to point directly at the missing outlaw nobleman. That generation of researchers assembled an unsettling pile of correspondences and other evidence which they used to try to sway the historical establishment. And I should probably mention here that the researchers generally came from outside academia, which always adds significant difficulty in getting a historical theory taken seriously. Columbus's signature, the strange pyramid of Greek and Latin letters, lines up with the abbreviations a Galician nobleman of his rank would have employed. Several of the place names Columbus assigned during his first voyage, echolocations clustered tightly around the Sotomayor estate. There was a San Salvador, a Punta Lanzada, a Bayona, a Porto Santo, all place names that were common around the estate. Some contemporaries referred to his flagship not as the Santa Maria, but as La Galega, the Galician woman. However, the mainstream explanation of this is that it was done because she'd been built in a Galician shipyard by craftsmen working in a regional tradition. Then there's the matter of the men around him, which some have viewed as a sign of Galician origins. The Pinzon brothers, who actually commanded 2 of the 3 ships, came from a port that had long-standing commercial ties to the Galician maritime world. Several of the lesser sailors on the 1492 voyage have surnames that turn up repeatedly in the parish records of Pontevedra. Other officers and pilots associated with the early Indies voyages can be traced back to towns within a day's ride of Sotomayor. For a Genoese outsider, Columbus seems to have arrived with a remarkably local crew. There's also the practical question of who could have led such a voyage. The Genoese version of Columbus's life has him learning the sea on coastal merchant runs, which is poor preparation for an Atlantic crossing. Madruga, by contrast, had run a private fleet for decades. He'd commanded raids along the Galician coast, escorted shipments to Portugal, and worked the same currents and wind patterns that govern any westward push out of the Iberian Peninsula. He'd also kept active contact with the Portuguese pilots, already probing the Atlantic islands in the 1470s and 1480s. The obvious objection is the simplest one. If Madruga had survived his political collapse and reinvented himself as a navigator, why bother scrubbing the past at all? The proponents of the theory have a ready answer, and it's the part that's hardest to dismiss. Madruga had been formally excommunicated. He'd been declared a traitor by the Catholic monarchs. His own son in Galicia was still tangled in legal fights over the family titles, and any acknowledgement that the father was still alive would have collapsed those claims. If you wanted royal patronage in 1486, being the obscure son of a Genoese wool weaver was a far safer biography than being an excommunicated outlaw. There's also a strange thread in Columbus's behavior that makes more sense if you assume he had something to hide. He demanded extraordinary hereditary titles before he'd even sailed. Admiral, Viceroy, Governor of any lands he'd find, with 1/10 of all wealth in perpetuity to his heirs. Some have claimed that isn't a merchant looking for a commission, but a deposed nobleman trying to rebuild a dynasty from scratch, using a new continent as collateral. After his death, his descendants spent generations in court fights with the crown, trying to enforce those titles. Columbus also walked into the Spanish court as a supposed nobody, and somehow got an audience with the Queen within a few years. He had introductions from a powerful Spanish duke, and letters of support from churchmen who had no obvious reason to vouch for an obscure Genoese sailor. If you visit the old Sotomayor lands in Pontevedra today, you can stand in the family chapel where Pedro Madruga was supposedly laid to rest after his body was quietly returned from Castile. The crypt has reportedly been opened more than once by curious historians and by his own descendants, and each time the parish documents have recorded the same result. There's nothing whatsoever inside the tomb, no body, not a fragment of bone, no sign that anyone was ever in there. Meanwhile, in Seville, Columbus's own remains have been moved so many times, from Valladolid to Seville to Santo Domingo to Havana and back to Seville. This has created serious provenance issues, and modern genetic testing has produced contradictory and incomplete results about which bones really belong to him. Despite the intriguing parallels and historical oddities surrounding the life of Columbus, the scholarly consensus remains that he was Genoese. Perhaps the most compelling reason for this is that every Iberian person who wrote about him called him Italian or Genoese. If he had secretly been a Galician, it seems probable that someone would have wrote about that during his lifetime. This would be doubly true if he was the notorious outlaw Pedro Alvarez de Sotomayor. I also have some doubts that Queen Isabella would have worked with someone who was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. She was extremely religious by the standards of the day, an era where virtually everyone would seem extremely devout by our standards. The idea that she would have been fooled into letting her excommunicated nemesis go on a trip to the New World on her dime seems unlikely. That said, I can imagine the retort from believers in this theory would be that she knew and thought that he would fail. Another issue with the theory is the age gap between the two men, since they were close to 20 years apart. That's not a minor difference by any means, and to put this in context, this would be the difference between a 40-year-old and a 60-year-old man around 1492. I find it difficult to accept that no one would have ever commented that Columbus claimed to be 40, while he was, in fact, closing in on 60. I suppose it is theoretically possible to pull off such a charade, but I think it's exceedingly unlikely, especially in such a sun-soaked environment. Personally, I generally believe that the simplest explanation is best. Columbus came from a humble family and wanted to obscure his origins for that reason. He lived in a time where your birth largely determined your entire destiny, and Columbus clearly aspired to nobility, not mercantile success. He sailed to the New World seeking titles and positions for himself and his family in perpetuity. That said, there's enough oddities surrounding him that I'm definitely open to the idea that Columbus may not have been quite who he claimed he was. I don't believe, though, that the evidence is strong enough, at least at present, to say that he was Madruga. Somewhere on the plains of southern Britain, sometime in the middle of the 5th century, several hundred men sat down at a feast to make peace. According to the stories that survived, almost none of them walked away. The signal was a single phrase, slipped into the air in a language most of them didn't speak, and the knives were already under the table. Britain, in the 5th century, was truly in the throes of chaos, having had the light of the Roman world leave the island behind permanently. The legions had pulled out around 410, leaving behind a province that had been part of the empire for nearly 4 centuries. The Romanized aristocracy didn't vanish overnight, but the apparatus that had held the place together was gone. What replaced it was a patchwork of regional strongmen, surviving civil administrators trying to keep the Roman ways alive, and a Christian church doing its best to keep the lights on. The decades that followed are sometimes called the most poorly documented period in British history. Whole generations passed between the writers who left us anything substantive about them, at least in the surviving records. Into that vacuum walked the figure later writers would call Vortigern. Whether that was a personal name or a title meaning something close to High King or Overlord is still argued. Our best early source on the period, a sermon-like text written by the British monk Gildas about a century later, doesn't actually name him. Gildas just refers to a proud tyrant who, faced with raids from Picts in the north and Scots from the west, made a fateful decision. He invited a third group of foreigners across the sea to fight on his side. These were the Saxon mercenaries, and the cure, as it turned out, was worse than the disease. Vortigern, it would seem, decided that he had a mongoose problem, so he decided to import tigers. The full version of the story doesn't appear in writing until much later. It surfaces in a 9th century compilation, the Historia Brittonum, traditionally credited to a Welsh cleric named Nennius. It was considerably dressed up in Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century History of the Kings of Britain. The basic outline runs like this. Hengist, the Saxon chieftain Vortigern had hired, was running circles around his employer. He'd already maneuvered the British king into marrying his daughter Rowena in exchange for the kingdom of Kent, and his forces had grown well beyond what Vortigern originally bargained for. To smooth things over, Hengist proposed a peace council. British nobles and Saxon leaders would meet on neutral ground, leave their weapons at the door, and break bread together. Vortigern agreed, and 300 of his most senior men rode out to the meeting. The traditional location is somewhere on Salisbury Plain, and Geoffrey of Monmouth would later tie it to the standing stones we know as Stonehenge, though that flourish is plainly his invention. What the British didn't know was that each Saxon warrior had concealed a long knife inside his boot or beneath his cloak. The two sides ate and drank and talked about borders and tribute and how the island would be run. Then Hengist, watching the room, spoke a few words of Old Saxon that the British couldn't follow. The phrase preserved by later chroniclers is something close to "take your knives," and with that, every Saxon at the feast pulled his blade and turned on the man beside him. The slaughter was supposedly nearly total, given both the element of surprise and the fact that the Saxons had potentially been deliberately spilling their drinks throughout the feasting. Only Vortigern was spared, seized on the spot and forced to ransom his own life by ceding huge tracts of land. He gave up Essex, Sussex, and the territories that would become Middlesex, depending on which version you read. That's the legend, but the trouble is that almost nothing about it holds up under serious scrutiny. The earliest writer, Gildas, working perhaps 100 years after the supposed event, talks at length about Vortigern's catastrophic decision to hire Saxon mercenaries. He says nothing about a banquet or a signal phrase, and offers no targeted decapitation of the British nobility. For a man whose entire literary purpose was to catalog British calamity, that's a strange detail to leave out. Bede, writing in the early 8th century and drawing heavily on Gildas, also has no version of the feast. The story's first real appearance is in the Historia Brittonum, written more than 300 years after the event by an author writing about what he understood as a foundational disaster. By the time Geoffrey of Monmouth got hold of it in the 1130s, he was building a whole national myth around the ruins of the Roman province. The betrayal at the feast had grown into a cinematic set piece, complete with named characters and a quotable signal. Folklorists have pointed out that the structure of the story isn't even original. The motif of an enemy slaughtering unarmed guests at a feast, often after a coded word or a deliberate breach of hospitality, turns up across early literature. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it makes it more likely that it was either fabricated or exaggerated to fit certain motifs. The same beat appears in Norse sagas, in Irish legend, in continental chronicles, and Greek and Roman writings. It's the kind of story that travels, attaching itself to whichever local tyrant best fits. Even then, though, it's more widely spread than that, and similar stories appear in places as far away as Mesoamerica. In my view, it's simply the sort of story that has a universal quality that people enjoy hearing, so it could even have been invented from whole cloth for this situation. However, even if the exact event didn't happen, That doesn't mean nothing happened at all, and the mid-5th century in Britain was demonstrably violent. Archaeological work at sites like Wroxeter and Caister by Norwich shows a sharp collapse in Romano-British urban life within roughly the right window. Saxon-style burials begin appearing in the east in significant numbers from the middle of the 5th century onward. Cemeteries excavated at sites like Spong Hill in Norfolk and Mucking in Essex have produced thousands of cremation urns and weapons graves of unmistakably continental origin. Gildas describes a genuine catastrophe involving real Saxons, even if his geography is muddy and his chronology is loose. Most modern historians work with a handful of possibilities to resolve this historical mystery. One is that some specific act of treachery really did occur somewhere in the early years of Saxon expansion. Perhaps it was an ambush of British negotiators, or the betrayal of a fortified site through a feast or parley, and the memory of that incident swelled over generations of retelling. Another reading is that the story is essentially literary, a Welsh attempt centuries later to explain how a Romanized British elite could have been so thoroughly displaced by Germanic newcomers. This allowed them to resist imagining that their own ancestors had been outclassed in combat, and presented the Britons as honorable and the Saxons as nefarious. A few historians have even suggested that elements of the tale were grafted onto the figure of Vortigern from an older local legend of betrayal that's now been lost. Whatever the kernel of truth, the legend itself had remarkable staying power. By the High Middle Ages, it was being repeated in Welsh poetry as a kind of national wound, a primal moment of treachery. The men at the table, if they ever sat there at all, are silent now, and the plain they met on, if it was even a plain, has been plowed and grazed and transformed beyond recognition. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just jumping in to remind you to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the membership or the Patreon to take your support for my channel to the next level. Sometime in the late 790s, in a candle-lit chamber somewhere along the Rhine, the most powerful man in Western Europe slipped a wooden tablet under his pillow. He was past 50, and his hands had grown stiff with age and a lifetime spent on horseback, and he was trying, in secret, to teach himself to form letters. The man was Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks, and soon to be crowned Emperor of the Romans. His biographer Einhard recorded that detail during his lifetime, and historians have been arguing about what it means ever since. Could Charlemagne read at all, and could he even write his own name? And if he couldn't, who amongst the medieval nobility could? Most of us picked up the same mental image somewhere along the way, probably from Hollywood movies or from video games. That image is the medieval lord in his drafty hall, bellowing at servants, signing land grants with a clumsy cross because his great mailed fist couldn't shape the letters of his own name. The image isn't entirely wrong, but it's misleading in nearly every important detail. It comes partly from Victorian writers who wanted a dark age to contrast against their own self-styled Enlightenment. It also comes partly from a genuine medieval distinction that's been mistranslated for generations. When a medieval cleric called someone illiteratus, he didn't mean what we mean by illiterate today. Far from it. He meant that the person couldn't read Latin with any degree of proficiency. A nobleman who could read French, German, or English completely fluently might still be classed as unlettered by the church. The only language that really counted in clerical eyes was the language of Cicero and the Vulgate, and that single linguistic trick has caused enormous confusion. Generations of historians took medieval complaints about noble illiteracy at face value. Then historians quietly began noticing that those same illiterate nobles were sending each other personal letters, drafting wills, keeping account books, and reading romances. To understand the literacy of the medieval nobility, you have to keep two ledgers at once. There's Latin literacy, which is what the church meant by the word, and there's vernacular literacy, which is what we'd recognize as ordinary reading and writing in a person's native tongue. The two grew at different rates, in different regions, and among the genders in ways that still catch modern historians off guard. In the centuries after Rome fell, Latin literacy among the Western European nobility collapsed almost completely. By the year 700, even some bishops in Frankish Gaul were struggling with the basic grammar of the Vulgate. Aristocrats handed their administration over to clerics, not because the clerics were necessarily smarter, but because they were the only people who could draft a charter in functional Latin. This is the period where the popular image of the illiterate warrior aristocracy actually fits the evidence, more or less. What we don't know, and probably never will, is how many of those same warriors could read or write in their own languages. Vernacular writing didn't yet carry prestige, and so it didn't survive in the manuscript record. A Frankish count who could scratch out a note to his wife in Old High German would have left no trace of that ability, because nobody bothered to preserve such a thing. The Anglo-Saxon king Alfred the Great, writing in the late 9th century, lamented that hardly a single man in England could translate a Latin letter into English. Of course, in writing that, it seems to imply that the Anglo-Saxon nobility could indeed write in their own language. Charlemagne tried to change all of this backsliding, and his reforms are still the most ambitious literacy project we can point to anywhere in medieval Europe. From the 780s onward, he ordered cathedrals and monasteries across his empire to establish schools. He demanded clean copies of liturgical texts and gathered scholars from Britain, Italy, and Spain to staff a palace school where the children of the aristocracy were drilled in Latin grammar. Perhaps most surprisingly, there's significant evidence that a number of female students were also educated there, again contradicting modern views. But more on that in a bit. The school's chief architect was the Northumbrian scholar Alcuin of York, pulled from a cathedral library in northern England, and tasked with building a curriculum almost from scratch. The results were partial. His son, Louis the Pious, was genuinely fluent in Latin. His daughters were reportedly trained alongside their brothers, which was unusual but not unheard of in earlier aristocratic households. Charlemagne himself, by contrast, was a stranger case, and we don't really know where he stood for sure. According to Einhard in the Vita Caroli Magni, the emperor understood Latin perfectly well by ear, and could speak it when he had to. But his attempts to write came late in life and never quite stuck, a fact that seemed to bother him somewhat. The detail of the wax tablets under the pillow has the ring of truth precisely because it's so unflattering. A loyal biographer doesn't invent that kind of awkwardness about his own lord, who he portrayed in a glowing light. The Carolingian Renaissance didn't survive the political collapse of the empire after 840, but its books did. Roughly 9 in every 10 surviving classical Latin texts come down to us through Carolingian copies, which gives you some sense of how much was preserved before the next slide backwards. But something began to shift in the 11th century, and by the 12th it was unmistakable. Royal and noble households across the West were producing written records in volumes that would have been unthinkable 2 centuries earlier. The English Doomsday Book of 1086, the rise of universities at Bologna and Paris, the explosion of vernacular literature in Old French all came fast, at least relatively speaking. It points to a culture that was writing itself into existence at a rate not seen since antiquity. Henry I of England, who took the throne in 1100, was nicknamed Beauclerc, meaning fine scholar by chroniclers. They clearly thought it remarkable that an English king should be so at home around books and scholarship generally. How much of this filtered into the actual reading skills of the nobility is harder to pin down with confidence. Royal and ducal courts certainly employed clerks to do the heavy lifting of formal documentation, but a growing body of evidence suggests that by the late 12th century, a noticeable fraction of Western European nobles could read fluently in at least one vernacular language. A meaningful minority could also handle Latin by that time, and some of them could do it at a very high level. After all, this was the time in which it became both prestigious and trendy for nobles to send sons off to university. Women, oddly enough, come out of this picture rather well, which may contradict some preconceived notions about the medieval world. Noble girls were often educated as carefully as their brothers, partly because they were expected to manage estates during their husbands' long absences on crusade or campaigns. An intelligent and well-educated noblewoman could vastly improve her income derived from her husband's estates, which in turn increased her prospects for a good marriage. Lower status nobles could marry up and secure more politically useful alliances with a well-educated daughter than with one who didn't know her letters. The patronage of vernacular Romance literature in the 12th century was also overwhelmingly female. The correspondence of figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her descendants makes it clear we're dealing with genuine readers, not just rich patrons seeking to farm prestige. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the picture is much clearer with respect to noble literacy. Most Western European nobles of any real standing could read their own language with reasonable fluency, and a substantial minority were comfortable in Latin as well. They were also picking up other vernacular languages as well, with Italian and French being of particular interest. Other languages such as German or English were also fairly commonly picked up, though to a substantially lesser degree. The really striking development in this period isn't noble literacy itself, but the spread of literacy into the layers just below the nobility. Merchants, urban craftsmen, and even some of the more prosperous peasants begin to leave behind enough written evidence to suggest that something close to a reading public was forming. The invention of mechanical printing in the 1450s didn't create this audience. It found one already waiting and made these texts much more affordable.